Welcome into another edition of the Leadership Library, hosted by CEO and author Rocky Romanella. Rocky is the author of the book Tighten the Lug Nuts, The Principles of Balanced Leadership, and has over 40 years of business experience as a prominent member of the UPS Supply Chain Solutions team, as well as the CEO of Unitech Global Services. So sit back, grab your notebook, and take a seat, and get ready for this edition of the Leadership Library.
Welcome to the Leadership Library podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Roman. Now, hey, before we start, got a question that was, I think, a good question. I probably should have answered this one. The question was, how did you begin this process of writing the book? Good question. Now that I'm reviewing it with you, it always starts with me with a process, right? So for me, the process was to write things down and answer the first question, not the ones we talked about at the last podcast, but for me, the first question is always, what would good look like? What would a good book look like? The next question then would be, what am I trying to accomplish in this book? And then finally, if I succeed with that, what value am I having? What value am I leaving to others? And so I start with those questions, and then I start to think about how I would answer those questions. And then, of course, the questions then come out, who am I writing this book for? And then what are the central messages? I kind of summarize those. I didn't articulate them, write them down that way, but those are good questions that I get asked all the time. And really, when you think about the process I took, that's probably what I was trying to do, was answering those two questions. But that to me is how I started, with a process and answering those questions. So this podcast, hopefully I answered that question to the individuals who asked that question, how did you begin? I'm summarizing quite a few questions that all were kind of around that whole question. How did you begin this? So let's talk a little bit today. The question that next question I get all the time is like, who's this Joe Scafone? Now, so when I was writing this book, I could never talk. I never liked talking about myself in the first person. And so years ago, before the book, Joe Scafone was created. How Joe Scafone was created, I was sitting at a meeting 30 years ago or now or so, and I wanted to challenge people to not stop at the first right answer. But I found whenever somebody brought me an idea, if I said, well, what if you looked at it this way, or what if you did it that way, people would look at me, and I always felt like they thought that I wasn't happy with the way they were doing it, or I found an issue with why they're doing it, or a problem. But that was never my intention. So one day I'm sitting at a meeting and I said, hey, I think that's a good idea, but you think Joe Scafone thinks that's a good idea? And they kind of looked at me and they said, Joe Scafone? I go, yeah, Joe's a good guy. He's got a lot of good ideas. You think Joe would think it's a good idea? And they looked at me and they smiled and they said, oh, I don't know. I said, well, think about it. And so that became my way of challenging people in a positive way. What would Joe Scafone think? You think Joe Scafone would think it'd be a good idea? And so later on, as people would come to a meeting, they'd say, hey, I covered this with Joe. He thinks it's a good idea. And I would say, that's really great, but it'd be nice if I had a chance to maybe review this a little bit, right? And I'd talk a little bit about this with you. So for me, Joe Scafone was my way of challenging you not to stop at the first right answer and be able to have a way to make you think about, how do I, is there another way for me to look at it? It was also a way for me to be humble, right? Because if you think about it, if I say to you, well, I think I would do it this way, or I think maybe you should look at this, the I kills you all the time, right? And then if you're the person that they're reporting to, now they feel like they have to disagree with you. So many people won't just disagree, right? But they can disagree with Joe. Joe's not a problem. So then Joe became this individual who became sort of the individual who helped me not use the word I, but also challenge people. So when I wrote the book, I wanted to talk about the many lessons I learned through my career, the wonderful people I met in my career, the wonderful people who helped me in my career, and maybe some of the people that I had the privilege and opportunity to help in my tenure. But it was easier for me to talk about it from a Joe Scafone perspective. And then I love telling stories, as you can all tell now through 4 seasons or 8 seasons. So it just gave me a way to tell stories, analogies, and maybe make you laugh a little bit. So that's who Joe Scafone is. I think at a later date, I'll actually tell you a Joe Scafone story if you really want to know. So hang in there. Maybe you'll hear that Joe Scafone story soon enough.